The wind did not howl. It hissed a low, constant scraping against the frozen bark of the birch trees, sounding like 1,000 dying breaths exhaled into the endless dark. It was the winter of 1943, deep within a nameless forest on the Eastern Front, where the mapmakers had long since stopped drawing lines of advance and retreat. Here, the world had been reduced to 3 elements: ice, iron, and the brittle fragility of human flesh. The snow fell not in flakes, but in hard crystalline shards that cut at the exposed cheeks of the men who crouched in the jagged gouges of the earth. They were a battalion in name only. In reality, they were a collection of ghosts, hollow-eyed and starved, wrapped in filthy, lice-ridden wool that had long lost its ability to hold warmth. The temperature had plummeted so far past zero that the air itself felt heavy, viscous, freezing the moisture in their lungs with every labored breath. It was a cold that did not just freeze the skin, it sank into the marrow, slowing the blood, numbing the mind, and gradually eroding the very concept of humanity. In this white abyss, the great geopolitical struggles of the 20th century, the speeches of dictators, the grand strategies of field marshals, the sweeping arrows on operational maps meant absolutely nothing. There was only the trench, the frostbite, and the terrifying, suffocating wait for the dawn. Discipline, in a military sense, is an illusion maintained by routine, consequence, and a shared belief in a higher purpose. It is the invisible thread that binds a farmer to a factory worker, turning them into a cohesive machine of war. But under the weight of absolute terror, when the body begins to consume itself to survive, that thread phrase, for weeks, these men had been subjected to a merciless, rhythmic bombardment. The Soviet artillery did not aim for strategic destruction, it aimed for psychological annihilation. The shells would fall at random intervals, sometimes a deafening barrage that tore the forest to splinters, sometimes a single lonely explosion in the dead of night, just enough to ensure that no one ever truly slept. The men had learned to distinguish the sounds of the incoming death, the heavy tearing scream of the high explosive, the sharp, cracking whip of the mortar, but the worst sound was the silence that followed. In that silence, the mind played its cruelest tricks. It was in the silence that the men heard the phantom footsteps of approaching infantry, the whispered voices of home, the slow, agonizing realization that they were never going to leave this forest alive. At the center of this frozen purgatory stood Major Kless, a man whose spine was kept straight not by courage, but by a fanatic, unyielding devotion to doctrine. He was a veteran of the early, victorious campaigns, a man who still believed in the invincibility of the uniform he wore, even as it rotted on his soldiers' backs. To Kless, the men in the trench were not individuals, they were numbers on a ledger, expendable resources to be spent in the pursuit of an objective. He paced the command dugout, the leather of his boots stiff with frost, a monocle reflecting the dim sputtering light of a single kerosene lamp. He held a piece of paper in his gloved hands, a fresh directive from high command, transmitted through the crackling, dying field radio. The order was simple, elegant in its cruelty, a dawn offensive. They were to abandon their entrenched positions, cross 300 meters of open, snow-covered ground, and assault the fortified Soviet ridgeline. It was a tactical impossibility. The men had almost no ammunition. Their rifles were prone to jamming in the severe cold, and many could not even stand without assistance, their feet black and rotting inside their boots. It was not a tactical maneuver. It was a sentence of execution. When the order was quietly passed down the line, moving from trench to trench like a localized plague, the reaction was not panic. Panic requires energy, a surge of adrenaline that these men no longer possessed. Instead, there was a profound, suffocating stillness. The men looked at each other, their faces smeared with soot and dirt, their eyes reflecting the same terrifying revelation. The illusion had shattered. For months, they had endured the unendurable because they clung to the lie that their suffering had meaning, that their commanders knew what they were doing, that survival was a reward for obedience. But this order, this casual demand for suicide, stripped away the final layers of the lie. They were not soldiers defending a fatherland. They were meat, being fed into a grinder by men who sat in warm rooms hundreds of miles away. In the darkest hour before the false dawn, a subtle, telepathic shift occurred in the trench. It was not planned. There were no whispered conspiracies, no ringleaders organizing a revolt. It was a spontaneous collective awakening of the survival instinct, overriding months of deeply ingrained conditioning. The fear of the enemy across the field was suddenly eclipsed by the fear of the man behind them, the man who was forcing them to walk into the slaughter, a young private, no older than 18, whose hands trembled so violently he could barely hold his Mauser, sat against the frozen mud wall. Beside him, an older corporal, a veteran of Poland and France, slowly reached into his tunic and pulled out his remaining ration of stale bread. He did not eat it. He just stared at it, as if trying to remember what it felt like to be full, to be warm, to be human. At 0500 hours, Major Kless emerged from the dugout, his Luger drawn, his voice cutting through the freezing air like a rusted blade. He shouted the preparatory commands, expecting the familiar, mechanical response, the shuffling of boots, the clicking of rifle bolts. But the trench remained silent. The men did not move. They sat frozen like statues in a museum of despair. Kless's face contorted, a mixture of confusion and sudden, sharp rage. He marched down the line, stopping in front of the older corporal. He screamed an order, the veins in his neck bulging against his collar, demanding obedience, threatening a court-martial, threatening the firing squad. He pointed the barrel of the Luger directly at the corporal's forehead. The corporal did not flinch. He looked up at the major not with defiance, but with an overwhelming, pitying exhaustion. In the corporal's eyes, Kless saw the horrifying truth. The threat of death holds no power over a man who has already accepted that he is dead. What happened next was not an act of heroism, nor was it a glorious rebellion against tyranny. It was a raw, animalistic spasm of self-preservation. As Kless's finger tightened on the trigger of his pistol, ready to make an example of the corporal, a shot rang out. It did not come from the Soviet lines. It came from the shadows of their own trench. The young private, his face pale as the surrounding snow, had raised his rifle and fired. The bullet struck the major in the chest, the impact throwing him backward onto the icy floor of the trench. The sound of the gunshot seemed to echo forever in the confines of the earthwork, a deafening crack that shattered the psychological barrier between order and chaos. For a terrible, suspended second, no one breathed. The major lay in the snow, a dark, spreading stain of crimson melting the white crystals beneath him. He was gasping, his eyes wide, staring at the gray, indifferent sky, unable to comprehend the betrayal. Then, the discipline that had held an army together for years unraveled in a matter of seconds. The junior officers, rushing forward at the sound of the shot, were met not with salutes but with the cold, black muzzles of 50 rifles. The men stood up, their movements slow, deliberate, driven by a terrifying silent consensus. There was no shouting, no cheers of liberation. Just the grim, mechanical disarmament of their superiors. Those officers who reached for their weapons were cut down immediately, their bodies falling silently into the snowdrifts. It was a methodical butchery, born not of malice, but of the absolute necessity to eliminate the mechanism of their own destruction. Within 10 minutes, the command structure of the battalion had ceased to exist. The officers were dead or bound, and the radio had been smashed into unrecognizable fragments of bakelite and wire. The men stood in the trench, the heavy snowfall slowly covering the bodies of their former commanders. They had committed the ultimate military sin. They had mutinied. In doing so, they had sealed their own fate just as surely as the suicide charge would have. If the Soviets did not kill them, their own military police, the execution squads that roamed the rear lines, eventually would. But as the sun began to rise, casting a pale, sickly light over the frozen wasteland, a strange, haunting peace settled over the trench. For the first time in months, they were not waiting for an order. They were not bracing for a charge. They sat down in the snow, leaning against the cold earth, pulling their coats tighter around their emaciated frames. Some closed their eyes and simply let the exhaustion take them, slipping into the heavy, seductive sleep of hypothermia. Others stared out into the falling snow, watching the flakes drift gently to the ground, burying the blood, burying the iron, burying the war. They had bought themselves nothing but a few extra hours of life. But in those final quiet hours, in the heart of a frozen hell, they had ceased to be weapons. They had become men again, reclaiming their deaths from the empire that had tried to steal them. And as the snow thickened, painting the entire world in an unbroken, silent white, the forest swallowed their secret, leaving only the wind to whisper over the graves of the forgotten.